So Glyn, can you tell me right now, is it good or bad times for air cargo?
That's actually a really great question to start the discussion with, because I would say it's kind of mixed. And I know that sounds like a little bit of a weak answer, but any time that there are geopolitical tensions which impact global society, ultimately you could say that's not good for the air cargo industry, because it's not good for the global economy, because it's not good for national prosperity, because it's not good for individuals. If we as consumers are feeling somewhat, I wouldn't say concerned, but if we're somewhat focused on geopolitical situations and the risk of war spreading, et cetera, we're not in the right frame of mind to go out and buy new stuff. So consumer sentiment is really what drives this industry. So anything that negatively impacts the consumer, you can ultimately say is not good for air cargo. However, you then have the second aspect to that question, which is, well, that's all well and good for the consumer side, but within the supply chain community, what's happening right now, for example, in the Straits of Hormuz, even though a lot of the container ships that are constrained from moving freely through the Straits are not carrying air cargo equivalent products. They're carrying oil, a lot of fertilizers, a lot of potassium, for example, aluminum, etc. These are things that wouldn't fly on air, but they are causing disruptions to maritime supply chains. So there are a number of container ships, and those that would be going in and out of the port are either slow steaming because they don't want to get there and just effectively just berth in the middle of, or out in the ports, or out in the Gulf of Oman. So that is taking out about 6 to 8% of global maritime capacity. So anytime you take out maritime capacity, anytime the maritime industry is suffering from reliability, then that's good for air cargo. Because there is a
level of substitution here, right? I mean, not entirely, but to a substantial degree. I feel I thought it's kind of surprising, but there is.
Absolutely, and that substitution aspect, and that's a good phraseology, is based on the critical aspect of what's moving. You know, we see this every time there's disruption, whether or not it's, let's say, for example, when the West Coast strike happened, I'm going back about 7 years, all of a sudden now McDonald's was running short of French fries in the US. So stuff that would never normally fly in an airplane, now it has to. It becomes so critical and urgent. And that's where air cargo really is. Right now, we're, over 2 months into the situation in Iran. Most maritime supply chains are basically 4 to 6 weeks. So now we are 2 to 4 weeks beyond when people were expecting their ships to arrive and their maritime goods. So now they're saying, I can't wait any longer. I have to fly by air. So there has been some positives for the charter market. So it's kind of mixed, because then the next aspect of that is, well, what about the costs of air cargo? Because
that's right.
We hear 31% of containerized oil goes through the Straits, going to different parts of the world. Even, and I find this part fascinating, the US is saying, yeah, but we get less than 1% of our oil comes through from the Gulf. And yet US fuel prices, which does not come from the Gulf, have gone up $1.25. They've seen a 30-40% increase in some cases just because of the global shock.
It's a commodity. I mean, it doesn't matter where you produce it. The price is a global price. It's just
the price has gone up. Yeah.
And if you produce it, you can benefit from the higher prices. Yeah. But the users of the oil, they will still face the higher cost.
Exactly. And in aviation, which is actually Jet A1 kerosene, is quite highly refined. So the usual barrel price, for example, for prior to the war breaking out, was around $100 a barrel. For the last 2 years, it's been pretty stable. So already it's running at about a 40-50% premium to normal, as it were, when you get WTI or Brent, when you see those barrels of oil prices quoted on the financial markets. But now we're looking at about $200 a barrel for jet kerosene. So, and there's also what they call the crack spread, which is what the oil companies are making above the refinery costs. it's about $60 to $70 per barrel. There's a lot of money to be made here. There's a lot of challenges. In some parts of the world, we're hearing that fuel supplies are running quite low. Some of the airlines are saying if this situation continues through to, let's say, the summer schedule, then they may not be able to operate all the flights that they had planned. The costs are going up. So whether or not it's passenger or cargo, fuel surcharges are having to get introduced. In some cases, the fuel surcharge level is higher than the actual rate per kilo in cargo. If you're operating an aircraft as well that's not necessarily as fuel efficient as some of the other more modern aircraft, you're having to put on even more in terms of a fuel surcharge. So it means the cost of using the network is more expensive. Sometimes then the products that are being air flown, it's a case of, well, can we afford to now as a manufacturer to move, for example, some flowers, the low yielding flowers and the agricultural products? That's a big challenge. The counter side of that equation is they've got customers overseas. So some of the manufacturers or the growers have to fly them because this is a temporary situation. They can't say to their customers, sorry, not going to supply you for the next 4 weeks. Then their customers, whether or not it's a retail chain, go and find new supply chains. So there's lots of consequences. So, the situation that we have when we have any shock to the system, and price of oil is a good example, it impacts the costs of the industry operations. It in fact impacts demand because consumer sentiment is weakened. Consumers are paying more for staple items, so therefore they have less discretionary money. It's also impacting traditional buyer-seller relationships. And ultimately, therefore, it impacts capacity because if the airlines now have a lot more, particularly in the Middle East, there's a secondary impact. So it's the price of oil, but it's also the risk and the safety aspect. So capacity in and through.
So how important is the capacity of Gulf carriers when it comes to air cargo?
A great question.
On a global scale.
Really great question. Let me give you two really good examples. If you look at China to Europe, 25% of the capacity on China to Europe was going via the Middle East. That's actually a relatively small amount of capacity. The Chinese carriers would carry the vast majority of, for example, the e-commerce and other things coming to Europe. They also have overfly opportunities through Trans-Siberia. So Chinese carriers have a much greater advantage of going direct. So therefore, they would tend to do that. Middle corridor is now picking up some of that slack for the 25% that was going through the Middle East. And that's going through whether or not it's Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan or other of the middle corridor options. The Middle East has started to open up, and we can talk about that in a little while about the dedicated air cargo capacity is starting to pick up. But the more impactful market is India. India to Europe was about 80 to 90% going through the Middle East. That's a huge percentage. That's a huge amount to rely upon. It was predominantly because there are very few Indian registered freighters. So they rely exclusively on foreign entities.
So when we are talking about this, then we are talking about full freighters, aircraft, or also including belly cargo.
Yes, but coming out of India, because it's now such a manufacturing hub, I'm mostly focusing on the full freighter aspect, yes. So the main deck capacity that was coming out of India, moving pharmaceuticals, moving fresh fruits and vegetables through to Europe, when the war happened in those first 3 or 4 weeks, when there was lots of intra-Gulf attacks, so it wasn't just on Iran, but it was within the whole GCC, when that capacity disappeared, it really hugely impacted those India to European supply chains, even to the extent some of it was going the other way around, which is quite a long journey. That adds significantly to the cost.
How much longer is the travel time if you go the other way around? Do you know?
Well, it's actually
the flight time.
It's more than just the travel time, because you might only add, let's say, 12 hours for flight time, but it's 2 more flights. It's actually crew hours. It's aircraft utilization. It's the fuel burn. So when we're doing comparisons to maritime, for example, 6 weeks as a comparative, and say, well, if I fly from India to Europe via the Middle East, might do it in, let's say, 14, 16 hours with good transit. If I go the other way around, it might be 24 to 30 hours. Doesn't seem a huge amount when you're comparing to things going on a ship. but it's everything that's associated that: crew hours, rest, fuel and technical stops. So it really does add significantly, and it takes capacity out. Now, if your plane is out for an extra 12 hours worth of, or 14 hours worth of journey time, the customers, that plane was expected to fly out yesterday from Europe to somewhere, but it's still en route because it's gone the other way around. So this industry's efficiency is based on optimization. Anything that impacts optimization, even the Russian-Ukraine war, where were the countries in the EU, for example, that had issued sanctions, were then their carriers, national carriers, were removed from the ability to overfly Russian airspace. So if they were going from Asia to Europe, carriers were now having to go southerly to avoid Russian airspace. That would add 2.5, 3 hours. They'd have to do a fuel stop, added significantly to the cost. And now, of course, the fuel burn. And now they're having to go around the Middle East as well. So a southerly route. And then you have to have a decision to go north or south of the Middle East. So that's why we say in this industry, how far forward can we actually project what's going to happen? And they say, if we're lucky, a week, because we really don't know what impact's going to happen beyond that.
And I think what's also interesting is the comparison with the COVID period, because during the COVID period, and this is also why I asked in the very beginning, is it good or bad times? During COVID, I think air freight was like similar to maritime industry, really very profitable businesses. But I think the situation was very different because look at the oil prices. During COVID, they were even negative at some point in time, right? Yes. And now they are so high. So I think that is really, for that reason, the situation is really not comparable. Would you agree?
I think you're absolutely 100% correct there. Yes. I mean, COVID was we hope, never to be repeated situation. But from an air cargo perspective, it was also, as you've said there as well, it was unique in so many aspects. 60% of global aviation was grounded. There was no belly capacity available because those planes were sitting on the ground somewhere. Global demand for PPE, which none of us had face masks, or very few of us had piles of face masks hanging around. So now the demand for PPE meant I need it to protect my citizens tomorrow. Well, when you need something tomorrow, there's only one mode of transport, wherever they're manufactured in the world. Operating costs were negligible. Nothing else was in the air. You had no stacking. You had the most efficient flight times ever, because of course you just had direct straight crow flies opportunities, perfect descent landings. Fuel price was very low. Demand for the limited aircraft flying was so large that, the price and the cost of some of those charters, it's human lives involved. These were countries bidding with other countries to say, I need 5 charters coming in 2 days full of face masks or other equipment to help my hospitals, etc., way before the vaccines. So the demand was through the roof. And then, of course, what the industry did as a way of trying to satisfy that overwhelming demand was use passenger aircraft. So the industry has about 2,500 freighters. There were about 3,500 passenger aircraft that were being deployed for cargo-only operations. Again, if you think about it, Transport Canada, EASA, the FAA, they'd never been asked to approve cargo on passenger seats before. So they had to actually step up and very quickly assess safe transport of cargo in cabin. So new regulations were effectively implemented in days as opposed to months, which would be the normal course of action. Special handling was also introduced because you're now potentially loading 10,000 boxes onto the seats of a 777 passenger aircraft, as well as 35 tons in the belly of that aircraft. So now we have passenger planes, or we had passenger planes flying around as mini freighters. And again, that's one of the other unique things about the industry. You have to have that innovative, adaptive spirit because we really don't know what we're going to be dealing with next.
And getting back to oil prices, how about fuel hedging? I mean, I find it so fascinating because if you look at the integrated carriers, basically mainly focusing on the passenger business and doing as a side business the belly cargo, then I think the picture is really mixed. U.S. carriers, almost no hedging. In Europe, I think there were some carriers like Ryanair and others who have very substantial hedging. So it's really like all over the place. There are some carriers that do a lot of hedging. I think they do now right now very well, and others will not do very well. How about air cargo airlines? How do they handle are they usually hedging?
I mean, that's a great question as well. I mean, it's different scenarios. You can't really use one answer fits all, because, as you said, Ryanair, because it has a very definable margin, a very small range of margin, it likes to control its cost base very much significantly. So their hedging is actually more of a procurement strategy rather than, I think, a speculation strategy. So it's a case of I can control my costs. So it's forward contracting. I mean, we use hedging. Hedging implies much more of a financial management tool, where you're looking at, well, what's going to happen with the markets. But in the airline industry, quite often it's actually just forward contracts, so I can secure my supply at a fixed price for my season. That way I don't have to adjust my prices up and down. I want to have a €9.99 flight. So therefore I need to have the fixed amount of fuel. But it's also interesting, in the US, they have a different approach to fuel farms as well. In each airport in the US, they tend to have a consortium based where the airlines get together. They don't negotiate on the price, etc., but it means that they are looking at an aggregate amount of demand. So it's not so much about me wanting to secure X percentage and I don't care if anybody else is trying to secure it. We kind of aggregate what we all want, so the fuel farms around the airports can make sure there's adequate supply there. So it tends to lead to a different approach to fuel.
But do these fuel farms also help control the price then? Isn't the price still determined by the world sort of market?
Well, that's it. You see, the price, when and this is where the interesting thing is, when we have stability, as we had for the 2 years prior to February 28th of this year, the price aspect was pretty much well defined. Oil companies were quite transparent. Here's what it's cost. Here is what our margin is. So that in many respects, when you go back to times of volatility, that's when hedging would coming in. Okay, the price of oil is going up and down now dramatically, let's say 3 or 4 years ago. So most airlines are thinking, I cannot risk not hedging forward, because if something happens to OPEC and they decide to cut production by 1 million barrels a day, price of fuel is going to go up. But as we had such stability for about 2 years, what happens in times of stability? People forget volatility. So, you stop hedging. So invariably, it was only those carriers who really wanted to control the cost aspect that would go into it. Most carriers had forward contracts. Very few carriers operate on a spot rate. It's not like us. If I fill my car up, what's the price today? I'll fill it up today, or only put half a tank today and hope it goes down tomorrow. Aviation, it's forward contracts, but the period of time, quite often it's about 30 days. So a lot of those were coming up for renegotiation. And of course, if you come up for renegotiation 30 days into the current war that was going on in the Middle East, your price of fuel is going to go up, probably nearly double. At one point, we were looking at 100% increase prior to February 28th, and that was sort of the end of March time. It's still around 60 to 80% higher. So if you're having to secure your fuel, and on a cargo side, on some freighters, the fuel cost can be about 30 to 40% of your total operating cost.
Which is higher than for passenger aircraft, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, of course, you think the crew costs on a freighter, you have a cockpit crew of maybe 3 or 4. You've got some ground handling costs. You've obviously got aircraft leasing costs, but many of the freighters are a little bit older. So if they are converted ex-passenger aircraft, they tend to have cargo aircraft tend to be a little bit older for that reason. They're recycled passenger aircraft. So the financial costs of the aircraft are a little bit lower. So in which case, fuel is the big ticket item.
So I'm not sure you have answered the question with the fuel hedging. So is fuel hedging common for cargo airlines, or not so common?
Not so common. No, it's not so common. Okay. Because again, it comes back to What would be the reason behind that? It's because the passengers publish their fares for the season. So if I go online now, I want to know what my fare is for a passenger ticket because I'm buying a ticket today, but for a flight in potentially 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. Air cargo is much more dynamic. I'm booking space today for tomorrow or the day after. So from an airline perspective, a freighter perspective, I can actually negotiate my fuel next week is going to cost me 25 cents more per liter, per ton kilometer, whatever it is. I'm going to have to pass on that 25% increase to my rate. So it's a much more dynamic pricing structure, much more real time. So it's also much more volatile.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. How is the Gulf carriers' capacity and when it comes to cargo affected, and how does it affect basically global air cargo businesses?
Well, a great question again, because I said, if you look at the growth and the expansion of the Middle Eastern carriers, let's focus on big three of Qatar Airways, Etihad, Emirates, for example. The amount of freighter capacity that these three carriers have today is huge. Their global networks, the supply chains are very much premised on into or transiting via the Middle East. But of course, when there were threats to their airspace operations, all of those carriers, when the war broke out, end of February through March, had to severely curtail their operational scenarios. Since then, they have actually reinstated quite a number of interesting and again, varied and agile adaptive solutions. For example, Emirates now has some, road feeder services. So they're connecting a lot of the cargo that would have gone through or is landing in the Middle East, in Dubai, through into Kuwait and into Oman, for example, Muscat, where operations have still been relatively strong because they're a little bit further south from where the atrocities were. Qatar has actually opened up a limited number of Air Force protected corridors. So, they have been operating a limited network in a protected environment. So, of course, this has enabled them to actually get some cargo networks up and running before passenger networks. Passenger demand has dropped, as you can imagine, significantly. This is one of the real problems that the Middle East is suffering now, which is, of course, tourism drop. And about X percentage, globally about 45% of all cargo moves in the bellies. So whether or not it's through the Middle East with reduced bellies. So the freighter networks have been much stronger. Where the Middle Eastern carriers can fly direct, if they have traffic rights to go from Asia to Europe, but they were flying via the Middle East for convenience of network operations, where they can fly direct, they've been looking at flying direct. Where they can operate charters, they've been looking at operating charters. But I do notice all of the carriers have been able to probably recover their cargo networks much quicker than their passenger networks. And they're looking to extend those even further now as we go in towards May. A lot more network reestablishment is going to take place.
And if I remember correctly, India is heavily benefiting from this because they are one of the major markets for the Gulf carriers when it comes to cargo businesses.
Absolutely huge. I mean, if it wasn't for the Gulf carriers taking cargo from India, Indians' exports, Indians' economic growth would not be what it is. So there's a very real concern within India that the current rate increases are impacting some of the fresh produce that comes out of India, which is one thing. I think that's more of a short-term concern. But also, as the China Plus One strategy for manufacturers, India has been a huge recipient or beneficiary of that, and a recipient of increased investment in factory establishments. So long-term prosperity and economic stability is premised on that Middle Eastern capacity. So the other aspect of this is that every time we have a shock to the system, we have to say, well, how can we prepare and plan if a similar shock occurs next year? We hope this is a stability of now over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 or 100 years, but we can't take that type of guarantee, which is why China Plus One. China was one of the last countries to open after COVID. So production supply chains that were premised purely on Chinese production said, we're beholden upon other countries' policies. So that's where China Plus One kicked in with the diversification of production. So I think we might find now as well diversification even more. So it's not just country diversification, but it's also supply chain and capacity diversification.
And I think also when you said the shocks, they're difficult to predict, but also the point is, as was clear from our previous discussion, shocks can can look very differently. COVID is nowhere near to what we are observing right now. There are both shocks. Of course, COVID is still different in terms of orders of magnitude, but also in the direction that it works. So, it's difficult to predict the shocks. This is just because it's random.
Yes.
I would say largely random, but also, the type of shock and how it will be affecting the business is just so difficult to tell in advance. So I think I understand what you're saying with the diversification, finding now broader diversification in order to be protected against a variety of different shocks to the world economy, right?
Exactly, 100%.